already concluded my retirement ceremony, and I am on the very short road remaining to change careers and continue on with the rest of my life. So in that, I have a couple of people that have taken on parts of my job, the job that I've been doing for the last 5 years. One of those is Lieutenant Colonel Ryan Price. Lieutenant Colonel Price comes to us from the U.S. Air Force and the Air National Guard here in the state of Washington. He's got a pretty distinguished career, and quite unfortunately I can't go back through his career and really highlight lots of stuff he's done, but I know that he is an Air Force personnelist by training, and I know that he has done at least one solid staff tour back in Washington, D.C., basically coordinating large-scale or national-level staff actions for National Guard Bureau. And in that, he comes back to the state of Washington, and he's employed now by our Homeland Response Force, which is a large-scale sea burn response capability here in the state of Washington for FEMA's Region 10. He's a part of that element as a liaison officer, and he's now picking up a large part of our Cascadia subductions and planning responsibility. And so with that, rather than me standing up here and talking, I'm going to hand the controls over to Lieutenant Colonel Price and let him do the majority of the presentation, and then I'll come back at the very end and kind of tie some of it together. It's a very intimate group, so I would recommend if you have any questions along the way, don't hesitate, just maybe raise your hand, get our attention, and ask your question, and let us just very intimately go through this and see where we can go.
All right. Thank you. Thank you very much. It's on. All right, so just want to try and get a feel for where you guys are coming from. Could you just tell me real quick, who's in Dr. Scholl's actual seminar, the class? You guys are? Okay, and what's kind of your background? How are you coming into this?
So I have a background working on military base with one of the engineer battalions, and currently work with West Pierce Fire and Rescue down in Lakewood, Washington.
Oh, fantastic. Okay, good. How about you?
I work at City of Bellevue, and I am on the logistics team for the EOC there.
Ah, good. Good.
Well, let me state that I'm in the finance department. I take care of business systems, but when they activate the EOC,
You're there.
I'm not in the emergency department.
Okay. Well, hopefully we never have to cross paths, but it's good to know you're here. How about you, sir?
So, I'm just a graduate student interested in the topic. I'm looking in the area.
Okay. All right. And you're a reservist, Army reservist?
I am.
Okay.
I'm also in the MIPM program, the Masters of Infrastructure Planning and Management.
Okay.
So this class came up and said, hey, check this out. Okay, I will.
All right. Sounds good. And you're visiting as well?
Yes.
Okay.
I'm the chair of the Disaster Response and Preparedness Committee for the Structural Engineers Association of Washington, and heavily involved with the Washington Association of Building Officials and the AIA, American Institute of Architects, trying to develop and coordinate a program, integrate actually a program for building assessments, rapid assessments following the disaster for the Seattle area, that will be a subduction zone, one of the big ones.
Right.
And try to get that program integrated. So it's fascinating to hear how it really was and where we fit in.
Wow, fantastic. How about you, ma'am?
I'm a PhD student in Human Centered Design and Engineering, and I research how people get information in crises. My dissertation is about the 530 side.
Oh, good. Well, we'll talk about that a little bit today. I was one of the squadron commanders that provided some forces to help do some of the search and recovery for the human remains. So it was an interesting, challenging situation for sure. How about you, sir?
I'm a faculty in the Applied Management program. I work on numerical modeling of tsunamis largely and other natural hazards. We're doing some work in the state of Washington, developing tsunami models.
Okay. Ma'am, how about you?
I'm just an interested citizen.
I like that. Ma'am, how about you?
For me, it's kind of the same. I have no actual connection to disaster response. However, I work at Microsoft, at Global Security, and following the hurricanes, we had to help few people who were stuck in U.S. Virgin Islands. So it was kind of interesting. We use actually social media and internet to help this couple get out of it, but it's just nice to know a little bit more of how it actually plays out.
Good, very good. And how about you, ma'am? Just kind of asking them, trying to get an understanding of who my audience is.
Oh, okay. Well, I've worked in the Philippines on disaster risk reduction, and I'm a PhD student in urban design program, so disaster mitigation recovery.
Okay, good. Good.
We have one class member missing, but we expect her soon.
Okay, very good. Well, as Colonel Braun said, I'm one of 2 people replacing him. That's just how awesome he is. So you're fortunate to have him come here and brief. I think we were talking on the way over here. I think this will be his second to last opportunity to address an audience, so that's pretty cool. He's spent 5 years digesting this stuff, and I've spent the last, I think, 4 months trying to soak it in from him. So it's been a good experience so far. So just real quick, what we're going to, I want to make sure that there's a basic level of understanding of what the National Guard is, how we're different than the Army or the Air Force that most people think of. And then we'll talk a little bit about the gaining situational awareness, as you guys have been addressing in this term. Look at some of those deployments that you heard Colonel Braun was involved in, with the fires, response, that sort of thing. And then we'll look at how the National Guard looks at the CSC problem. And it's massive, so we won't go into a lot of details, but we'll try and hit the high marks there and see at least how we try to address that. And then we'll turn it over to Colonel Braun. He'll talk about how he sees the National Guard evolving, how it has evolved, and how it will continue to going forward. So understanding the National Guard, each state it's made up of, when you think back to the colonial times, the farmers that were responding to the call there in Boston, the militia, so the Minutemen. That's what the National Guard is. Every state has its own National Guard. It's made up of an Army and an Air Force component. So I'm in the United States Air Force, and the Air Force has basically 3 parts to it. It has the active duty component, which is where you see it at McCord Air Force Base, or Fairchild on the east side. It has a reserve component and a National Guard component. So those 3 make up the whole Air Force. So you're in the Army Reserves, he's in the Army National Guard, and then there's an active duty component as well. So that's kind of how the National Guard is organized, or falls under the bigger auspices of the Army and the Air Force. So in the National Guard, we've got 2 missions that are quite distinct. So the first one is we have the federal mission, which when people think of the military, we deploy downrange to do whatever our country asks. So that's the main mission there. And then the other mission that's special to the National Guard is that domestic response. We are responsible to the governor, day to day. He's our boss. He tells us, what to do. If there's a natural disaster or a man-made disaster, the governor can call us out and send us in to help assist local leaders. So here's kind of a spectrum. When we think of the National Guard, we have lots of different duty status. Now, I was active duty for about 9 years in the Air Force as a personnelist, and I came in the National Guard, and I realized I had to flush everything I knew about being in the military, because the National Guard has just a wide spectrum. So when you think of a disaster, a flood or fire, and you hear the governor called out the National Guard. Typically, it's in a state status. So the governor retains command and control. The state pays for the bill to the pay and allowances for those guardsmen. And usually you'll see a state active duty status will be for limited scope operations. When things get a little bit bigger, a little bit more complicated, then we can look at some of the other statuses. So in the middle is Title 32 status. This is a U.S. Code status. And essentially, it's the governor retains command and control, but the federal government foots the bill. So that's the main distinction there. So when you think Hurricane Katrina, or recently, Puerto Rico or the Virgin Islands, Title 32 is the typical status where you might find the guardsman in. And then finally, Title 10 is a federal status, and that's when we deploy downrange. So the president has command and control, and the federal government is paying the bill. So that's kind of the wide spectrum. So when something happens, to a guardsman, the first question we say, well, what status was he in? Because there's a whole different set of rules that we follow. So, but the great thing about it is it provides a great deal of flexibility. So we can respond in a variety of different capacities, depending on what the need is. So here in Washington, I threw this slide in here to just kind of, when we talk about domestic operations, these are some of the things that the National Guard can bring to the fight, right? So we've got a great medical capability, setting up base camps. When we deploy down there, it's all about setting up a camp in an austere environment. Search and rescue, the helicopters. We can provide water, power, generation. So lots of different capacities or capabilities that we have. And then we organize those into, we have some specialized response teams. So as was mentioned, I'm on the Homeland Response Force, so that's one that specializes in the chemical, biological, those types of disasters. So that's one particular capacity we have. We have lots of different equipment, trucks, helicopters, the ability to move stuff and get stuff done. In Washington State, we have over 8,000 National Guardsmen. About 2,000 of those are Air Force, and the rest is Army. Okay? So when we talk about gaining situational awareness, you guys, I know you've talked a lot about the landslide up there at SR 530. This picture here, this guardsman went viral. That was one, he took that picture, he found that in the rubble, and it wound up on the Secretary of Defense's social media as what Washington was involved in. So obviously it's a major disaster. And when we talk about situational awareness, I think this is a great case study of the importance of that. Because what we saw, where we started off when this thing first hit and where it ended up, was night and day. I remember it was a Saturday, I was out running errands with my kids listening to the radio, and I heard, oh, there's this landslide up in this place I've never been to before, and I was like, oh, that's another landslide, that's interesting. And then by the time Sunday rolled around, I remember hearing the reports again that it was, no, this is a big deal. And by the time Monday got rolled around and the Guard started mobilizing and getting in the situation there, I realized just how serious it is. One of, as I mentioned before, one of my groups of airmen, they responded to do some of the search and recovery of human remains. My background as a personnel in the Air Force deals with mortuary affairs. It's one of the things we do. And so I keyed in on this as the radio reports started coming across, and I was really shocked by what was going on and how serious it turned out to be. So just kind of the sequence there. At 10:37, the slide occurred, and those first responders, the reports that came in was like, hey, there's a slide, covered the roadway, and we think one house was impacted, right? So within an hour, they realized, oh, actually, there's about a dozen houses, and there's about 12 to 15 people that are in need of rescue right now. But don't worry, we got it. Those were the reports that were coming out. We can handle this. By 3 o'clock, the state EOC had gone up to phase 2 activation. 3 hours later, they were starting to realize how bad the situation was, and they went all the way up to 3. However, at this point, that first day, the Guard had not been contacted yet. That's ESF 20 is our FEMA code there, and we hadn't been told we need your help yet. So, so the challenges, that are out there, how, in a complex disaster like this, how do we really get a good feel for what's going on? you know, there's lots of challenges, I think, here in Washington State. You know, at least from the National Guard perspective, we don't work day to day in the National Response Framework and NIMS, you know, so there's some chunkiness to that. The home rule here, so the local authorities in Washington State are the ones that make the call. So it's, the governor can't say, all right, Snohomish, we're just going to drop on you. They have to ask for that, right? And then, of course, as we kind of highlighted already, just the inconsistent messaging that was kind of coming out of this. The first day they had 18 accounted for. I remember hearing on the radio, you know, by the day 3, there's 176 people. No one knew where they were. Not enough resources there to help answer all the media questions. And so there was a lot of frustration, I think, that was growing there. So there's a big challenge, right? So how do we overcome that? You know, here's the reality of that situation. In the end, there were 43 that were confirmed that had deceased there, and 58 homes. Of course, the slide went right across the road and completely separated Darrington. You know, so then on the other side of that, you have a whole flooding issue that's going on. And so just lots of challenges happening really, really fast that we didn't realize initially. So when we were finally on Monday, we started to mobilize our forces. These are some of the things that the National Guard brought in. During that operation, there was about 700 airmen and soldiers that responded. Particularly we had the fatality search and recovery team that went in to recover the remains. We had a search and extraction team, which is a unit that's specially trained to go into, you know, collapsed structures and pull people out. We had the decon teams that were there to help decontaminate, you know, the workers that were coming off the line, the dogs that were out there going through the rubble. They were there. The Black Hawk helicopters that were out there on the debris field helping to remove things, and lots of vehicles to kind of move things around. So I know this is really wordy, but I wanted to put it in here because this is one of the, I guess, after action items that really stood out to me from a situational awareness perspective. So, you know, basically we recognized we didn't understand fully what was going on initially, but some of the things that we recommended to help solve that going forward was basically employment of some type of an early asset. So we have a special team, civil support team that's on call 24 hours. They can respond, you know, within 2 or 3 hours. So if we get them right in there, so they can at least get, you know, boots on the ground. And I think that was really key. Once people started getting out and seeing what's going on there, that's when you saw situational awareness start to improve. You know, from the initial part of, oh, there's something happened, to the point of actually getting boots on the ground and seeing, you know, that made a huge change. So we have these air assets, these helicopters that they could fly over and do some surveillance of the area and get an idea. But that requires a proper use memorandum in order for us to get up there. So if we have something that's pre-coordinated, ready to go, all we have to do is just hit the switch and be able to implement those quickly. And then something that we've done put a lot of effort into since then is training liaison officers, getting them up to speed, because the more crosstalk that we have within all the different organizations, that's going to improve your situational awareness. And so putting some time and resources into training those, properly equipping them, and getting them out to all the different incident commands quickly. The faster we can do that, the faster we can understand what's going on. So some other disasters. So that was spring of September 2014. Later that summer, we rolled right into the fire season, which was at this time, 2014. It was the worst fire season in Washington State history, right? Super dry out there, and by mid-July, all all the national resources that were out there were pretty much tapped, or we were burning through them so fast that it was really, really concerning. And so this provided a big challenge to overcome. The governor recognized that. He initiated a state emergency a declaration, and then started to call out the Guard to organize them, to get them out, to try and help support DNR. So initially, helicopters went out to help support that, but within a couple days, the Carlton Complex fire, which destroyed 95 homes, resulted in a much bigger request for actual ground support. And so we sent some of our ground forces out to help the firemen on the line. And it was the first major mobilization of ground forces in this capacity since the mid-90s. So here's kind of some pictures of that operation and what went on. The map kind of here's the area where it was and how we had our forces arrayed there. So pretty successful experience there. Some of the missions that we conducted, you saw the water bucket going on there. Some of the things I just wanted to highlight, so those liaison officers, we got those out to all the different incident commands, right? That was really key. We also sent some of our forces out in vehicles, just kind of roaming through the various towns and neighborhoods doing health and wellness checks. Hey, do you need anything? We got, handing out water bottles or whatever it is. But just getting them out in the community like that helped us understand what was going on, and they then channeled that back up to when they saw a need, they were already out there ready to go and could address it quicker. Another thing that we have in the Guard, we have this Joint Incident Site Communications capability. We call it a JISC. So it's a comm package. We can set up, voice, internet, data out on site. So when you got these fire chiefs that are out there in the middle of nowhere with no comms, we can roll in a JISC, stand that up, support them, and help increase that situational awareness. Cool. So in the end, about 800 of our guardsmen responded, and overall pretty successful operation. Then the following year, when we thought 2014 was bad, 2015 turned out to be even worse. So you see here, snowpack, right, was 4% of the average. So just conditions were just right. The governor saw this, so he said, all right, I'm not even going to play around. We're going to do that disaster proclamation right now in May so that we can get the wheels in motion, right? So by June, we had already responded with our aircraft and helped to tamper those fires, and things kind of settled down. But back in August, it really just flared up, and it was so bad that all the natural resources in the area were depleted. This preparedness level 5 here for fire was the highest here in the Pacific Northwest. And so things were just getting tapped. So all the resources that were available were out, being used, and we were at risk of being basically overwhelmed. So building on what we learned in 2014, we leaned forward, we pulled in those ground forces again, and we're ready, and rolled them out the door as well to help. So here's, again, some more pictures of 2015. And this is a unique mission. This is not one that the military normally does. We get special training from DNR on how to help assist. So it's a unique capability that we now have gained because of the needs here in the Northwest. So a lot of the same type of operations happened in 2015. I threw this up. One thing about getting situational awareness, you fly overhead. Right, you can see what's going on. You can get the political leaders in a helicopter, the powers that be, fly them out. They more fully understand what's going on. So seeing, I think, is huge. Seeing what's going on is key. So this one, we about doubled the size of force that we sent out. They didn't respond quite as long, but it was a good operation there. So now we look at the CSZ, right? We're all familiar with this massive disaster that we hope never happens. We all hope to be retired and moved on to our nice retirement communities in Arizona. That's where I'm from originally. So it's a scary thing, and it's going to be a massive challenge. So when we look at this as the National Guard, so here's just one example from the high track study. Bridges that are going to be impacted, right? So people aren't going anywhere. All the roads going out to the coast, those are all gone. So it's a massive challenge. So when National Guard looks at this, and we really look at it, it's very similar to what you might face going into Iraq or Afghanistan, right? So it's a very austere, inhospitable environment, lots of challenges. There's logistics challenges. There's terrain that you got to overcome, trying to figure out how to navigate around where there's not roads. Lots of different people that you're trying to serve. So you've got citizens that are out there in need. There's volunteer organizations that are in the area looking to help out. And then of course all the governments that are out there. Each one's a little bit unique. So it's very similar if you look at it in that frame. This is really what the military is good at. We're good at going into these types of environments and being able to help leverage a positive response in a community. So we kind of look at the CSE in that frame. It's an inhospitable environment, but we possess skills. We can get in, we can move stuff, we can fly in medical, we can evac casualties. We can affect a lot of positive outcomes based off of our experience as military force. So when this thing happens, there's three I think critical missions that are kind of no-fail for us. If we can't get anything else done, we got to focus on these. We recognize in Washington State, a large portion of our force is going to be victims, just like the rest of the community. I mean, most of our people live on this side of the state, and this is the side that's going to be most affected. So we have that challenge to overcome. So despite that, some of the things that we can't fail on is we have to make sure that chain of command, the command and control continues on. So we've got plans for our Joint Operations Center, if it's not able to function here where it's located, to devolve that authority to the east side of the state over to Spokane, and have our air wing that's over there pick that up, establish contact with the state EOC, and conduct operations going there until we can get our feedback on the ground. Next one is we've organized, so taking the state's Homeland Security regions, we've assigned an 06 level command, a colonel coach command to each one of those regions, set up a geographic task force. So when this thing happens, we've got to get that headquarters element out there to those communities. Their job is to basically be there, link up with the county emergency managers, and be prepared to receive forces that are coming in from out of state. So that's key, that's got to happen. And the next one is standing up our Army aviation assets. Get the helicopters in the air, they'll be tasked with picking up key leadership, going out to the coast, doing search and rescue operations. So that's really key. So when we look at on the ground, how we're arrayed, so we take those forces and we're going to link them right up with the incident commanders, right? We'll put in units right there with the incidents. As a military, we're never going to be the lead agency. We are always in support of some civilian entity. So this is kind of how we've got it organized, right? So we got the state EOC. We're going to set up a dual status commander that's going to link right up there. At the county emergency managers, we're going to send one of these geographic task force like we've got there. That colonel is going to link up with that emergency manager in the county and say, okay, what do you need? We're here to help figure this out. And then down at wherever those incidents are, we're going to try and get LNOs out there, and units, as they start to flow in, they'll show up and they'll report to those incident commanders and they're like, hey, we're here to help, let's get this mission done. So that's kind of how we would organize ourselves. And we think that obviously getting boots on the ground, right, embedded with the incident commanders, that's going to increase situational awareness from a National Guard perspective. We'll be able to channel that information up quickly and help to affect a positive outcome. So, any questions? Got a question?
What capabilities does the, like the EOCs have regarding equipment, personnel to handle, like we see as the event outside of the military? I mean, why would we be secondary if the military is the one that has, I guess, equipment? I don't know.
Yeah, that's a good question. So you gotta remember that military is a support organization, right? We can't come in and just take over, you know, we don't want martial, we're trying to avoid martial law type. So we work for civilians, right? We work for the governor, he's a civilian. In the county, we're gonna engage right with whoever those civilian people are. They're the ones, I mean, like we said, this is a home rule state, so the local civilians are the ones that are making the call on what they need. The military will roll in to support them, and we can help propose solutions and work with them, figure out the problem. If they're like, hey, we got this need, the military can say, you know what? I've got a truck company that can move stuff that can help meet that need. And so we will work hand in hand with them. We'll never show up where we're the boss, right? We can always work for that. So does that answer your question?
Yes, I'm just wondering what capabilities does the state have outside the military? Do they have like contractors that they have? Like,
As far as manning their EOCs and that sort
not
of
just
thing?
manning them, but equipment wise. I guess that's what I'm thinking of. You know, let's say like getting bridges built or.
Yeah, so a lot of stuff will have to be contracted and pulled in from out of state, or, you know, other companies that have the ability to build a bridge or something like that. It can be hired, put on contract to do that.
I guess there's one other element in the question, and that is many of the civilian responders don't even know what the capabilities of the military are, particularly in reconnaissance. And we found that in our study on OSO, where basically the local responders, or the state even, did not know what the military had in terms of capabilities and functionalities. And it was through the liaison that you guys finally brought that in, right? And I guess that is why the liaisons are so critically important.
I think so.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. Did you have a question?
Yeah, you mentioned something early on about the military and NIMS, and I didn't quite catch that. So could you clarify?
Yeah, so you've got the National Response Framework, right? And you know what NIMS is?
Yeah.
Okay, so, I mean, day to day, we don't train and operate in NIMS. Like, I mean, we've got a military job that we do. NIMS is a civilian emergency management function, right? So we have done, I think, great strides in getting trained on that system. So, you know, all of our geographic task force, those commandos, 06s, they're going to have all the same training that an incident commander will have. So they'll understand, be able to talk the talk of what the NIMS system does and be able to respond to that. So we train our LNOs so that they get that as well. So when they show up to the incident commander, they're not having to learn,
Sure.
you know, what are these ICS Form 213? What do you want me to do? What? I don't understand. So they have some level of basic training so they can show up and they can integrate better, if that makes sense. But normally, you know, Monday through Friday, we don't live in that world that's out there.
Yeah.
Answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay. Cool. Well, I'll turn it over to Colonel Braun and have him
Thank you, Ryan.
expound wisdom.
We'll see about that. Thank you, Ryan.
Thank you.
To go back and clean up a couple of the questions I heard, the first one you asked is effectively, the way I heard it was, the military's got these great resources, why aren't they more active? Why aren't they more in charge of doing something like that? Well, the real answer is the only place on the planet that the military, at least in the continental United States, the military is actually in charge of disaster response. The only place is in Hollywood. Right? And that's the only place. It doesn't, our job, our authority is all regulatory. We are, by design in the United States, subservient to civilian commanders. The National Guard is no different from the active component in that norm. In the state, we work for the governor. The governor of every state has an emergency management capability, whether in the state of Washington, it's the State Emergency Operations Center. And so we become subservient to that. Now, in this state, it just so happens, there are, I think, 17 states in the nation where they take the adjutant general, the commander of the National Guard, if you will, and they elevate him to be in charge of emergency management within that state. This is one of those states. So the adjutant general of the state of Washington is actually the emergency manager for the state of Washington. He is the governor's right-hand man when it comes to disaster management. But our tag has to wear several hats when he does that. One of them is he oversees all of the State Emergency Operations Center. And if you see any of the slides from him, up here you see the Washington Military Department. They are part of that. This is, let's see which one of these is their seal. I guess they kind of use this one, I think. I'm not sure, but one of them is basically their seal. They're part of the same agency, but that's the civilian agency, and they're in charge of the disaster. We're the National Guard, the military component in that agency, and we just support them. So hopefully that answers that question a little bit better. The next question that you asked was, what does the state have for resources?
Right.
Well, the state has a bunch of resources. They've got all these other agencies out there that are organized by emergency support function. Right, ESF, if you're on the FEMA part, it's 1 through 15, right? ESF 1 through ESF 15. The state of Washington organizes the exact same way, except the National Guard in Washington becomes ESF number 20. There are only 16 ESFs in Washington. Why we're number 20 is beyond me. I still haven't figured that out after 5 years. But we're ESF 20, organized just the same way the federal government does. So all of those other resources, the Department of Transportation has a lot of resources out there for everything from road repair to bridge repair to ferries to whatever. I mean, they've got a lot of stuff. And there are other agencies that have a lot of other stuff. And then some agencies that really have only regulatory power and don't have hardly any stuff at all.
How does that agency interplay work? So when does the national level stuff come in after the National Guard?
I think I actually, that's another slide set I'm working on. I have a slide that addresses that perfectly, but it's not in this slide set. But effectively, there's a resourcing pyramid when it comes to disasters.
Yeah.
And every disaster starts locally, right? Every disaster is local. And so that means that the local owning emergency manager has first authority on it. And so they have the ability to bring their assets to bear, and when they're overwhelmed, they have an ability to reach out to their surrounding emergency managers through mutual aid. In Washington, we have a system called WAMAS, which is Washington Mutual Aid System.
Okay.
And all these emergency managers, they partake in the system. And it gives them a way to reach out to their friends and buddies, their relatives or neighbors, not relatives, I guess, neighbors, and pull in those resources. But when the local level is overwhelmed and no longer has enough resources, then that pyramid, it elevates. It can also elevate based on need for speed or on specific items availability, but in general terms, it elevates when the lower level is overwhelmed. And so if it's a local emergency manager, well, they might elevate to the county level. And that county then can apply their resources. They might have a county road works or county public works or whatever. And when they get overwhelmed, they can reach out through WAMAS to their mutual aid partners to bring in more resources. And when they're overwhelmed, they elevate it. So now it ends up at the State Emergency Operations Center. And the state can bring in all the state resources. That includes the National Guard. And then when the state is overwhelmed, they can reach out through at this point it's called EMAC, but it's effectively mutual aid. The Emergency Mutual Aid Compacts, it's all 50 states and 4 territories subscribed to. You can reach out and get resources from all those other states and territories. And then when your mutual aid capability there is overwhelmed and you continue to elevate, now you're going to the federal government, which is typically for disasters. The lead federal agency is usually FEMA. You go to FEMA and they levy the federal resources to help. And when they're overwhelmed, they can always go to the Department of Defense or other nations. Okay? So that's kind of this big pyramid of resourcing.
Thank you.
So I hope that helps. Yes, ma'am.
I have a question on that. Do you know of an agency that's ever devolved their authority?
Absolutely, absolutely, it happens, I mean, when you say an agency, of course, that's a very vague term, and we could always look to Puerto Rico and Virgin Islands from this last summer's hurricanes and see several incidents of devolution. And for those that aren't super clear with what the term is, of course, devolution, the way I simply describe it, is the last step in continuity of operations. Right? COOP, or continuity of operations, it starts, I think of it very simply in 3 layers. The first layer is all of my stuff is available to do the mission, but my people are not available. In the Washington Guard, we think of this like a winter storm. Right? Our buildings are there, but the people are stuck because the roads are covered with ice. So there we have to have a way to continue operations, maybe operate remotely from home or something like that. So there's a plan for that continuity of operation. The second level is the reverse. My people are fine, but my facilities are not available. You can think of that one very simply like maybe a building burned down. Okay, my building is gone, but I still have my people and I need to do my job, so let's move to an alternate facility and we'll continue the mission. And that's the second layer. The third layer is all of my facilities are gone and all of my people are unavailable. Now what do you do? And that's where you get into devolution. That's where you have to move the authority to actually accomplish that task to somebody else, somewhere else. And we have to plan for that, particularly in the Cascadia subduction zone response. We have to plan for the devolution of the authority to initiate the mission. And that's a big deal. But have we ever seen agencies have to actually devolve? Certainly. It's a really bad day when anyone has to do that, but we have seen that. Did that help?
Yeah, I mean, maybe later we can talk. I'm just curious, I'd like to give some examples.
Sure,
Yeah.
sure. And we have, our COOP planning gets into our devolution plan in great detail. And it's something that we rely on to respond to the Cascadia subduction zone. And it's not classified in any way. We're more than willing to share and give people ideas on how to do it. All right, so the evolving role of the National Guard. My job here, in my very short time remaining, been working on this problem for 5 years with the new tag, and so the big question is, where are we going, right? Where's the Washington National Guard going? And I know that at least the core students here are really interested in situational awareness. So we can kind of talk about that. And if I don't answer your questions in just what I'm saying, please redirect me and bring me back to it, because I'd love to talk to you about it. But when you talk about the evolution, where we've been for the Washington National Guard, my direct experience in this role goes back 5 years, which is fairly lengthy by today's standards. But I've been in the National Guard now for 29 years. And so I've had the opportunity to respond as one of the responders instead of one of the coordinators over the years. When our current Adjutant General took command of the Washington National Guard in 2013, when he was assigned by the sitting governor, that brought around an opportunity for a refocus or a repurposing. Right? The previous Adjutant General, Major General Lowenberg, was a very intelligent man, did a lot of great things for the state of Washington and the nation. But his focus was different than this Adjutant General. So when Major General Dockery took over, he wanted to refocus on preparedness inside the state of Washington. And he did that really just in the nick of time. We started a very detailed planning effort for the Cascadia subduction zone in around July of 2013 based on Major General Dockery's input. And thankfully we still haven't had to execute that one, but that planning effort started to fundamentally change how the Washington National Guard was looking at disaster response. And less than a year later, in 2014, of course in March, we had the SR 530 landslide. And that landslide made us, well, let me back that up. We responded and looked at that SR 530 landslide much the same way that we will respond and look at the CSZ response. Just on a much smaller scale, obviously. So it was quite timely for us to do that. Certainly it was a tragedy, though. The SR 530 landslide was a tragedy, but for us it was a great learning experience. And then from there, we continued into the fires of 14 that Ryan talked about, and all that did was expand our knowledge and expand our level of experience and improve the way we looked at everything we were doing. Everything from mobilizing and deploying forces to planning for that, sustaining them. At the end, we have to reconcile the use of any force. Someone has to pay for it, and so we have to track every single expense. And it's a very lengthy and elaborate process, so we got much better at that. For situational awareness specifically, 2013, our systems were rudimentary. The military is constantly redefining itself, it's constantly reinventing itself. And so we go through cycles of a unit getting really, really good at something, and then allowing that to atrophy, and then they start over and get really, really good and atrophy. It's natural in the military. By 2013, our ability to respond domestically in the state of Washington had atrophied. We had, for the previous 10 years, been very focused on missions overseas. And we got very, very good at mobilizing organizations and sending them to Iraq or Afghanistan. But our ability to respond in the state had atrophied. So by 2013 and 2014, we were really trying to refocus on understanding our own ability to mobilize, our situational awareness, if you will. When we put someone in the field, what are they doing? How do we control them? How do we reconcile their actions? How do we manipulate them? How do we change their direction? So those are all key tasks, and we can talk about some of that in great detail. 2015, we just got better. We continued to improve. By 2015, we were ready to begin exercising our earthquake planning. And so in 2015, we did a statewide internal exercise called Evergreen Tremor that took our draft Cascadia Subduction Zone Response Plan and put it out there for the National Guard, for our units, subordinate units to work. And we worked with several hand-selected state agencies that were our partners. We didn't have the bandwidth to work with everybody, so we worked with a few key players. And we learned an awful lot from this exercise. When you talk specifically systems for situational awareness, this was a propellant to get us to completely change the way we were looking at systems. And we began to modify some of the technology associated with situational awareness. By 2016, of course, we rolled into Cascadia Rising. And if you haven't heard already, and I think you have, this class is very familiar with it, Cascadia Rising, the last count I got from our FEMA partners was over 23,000 participants across multiple states and national elements. And this is going to sound very egotistical, and I apologize, but it really all started right there. Right? It all started with the Adjutant General saying, I want to plan on this Cascadia Subduction Zone rupture. And so the planning team developed it, and at the very beginning meeting for this, there were 3 of us at that meeting. It was myself, from the state EOC, a guy named Lt. Dudley, and from FEMA, a guy named Steve Simmerly. And we sat down and we started trying to figure out what this exercise is going to look like. And I would love to tell you that was a relationship that never had a flaw in it, and it just worked perfectly, but that would be an outright lie. It was at times, it was almost a boxing match with those other 2 gentlemen everyone had an agenda, everyone had objectives they were trying to meet, and the 3 entities' objectives were not always fully supporting. So we had to kind of battle our way through it. Yes,
For example, I mean, it's abstract. Would you be willing to say what?
Sure. FEMA, in something like this, FEMA's big challenge is getting large-scale resources to an incident site and then getting them employed. That means they have to have a request someone has to have situational awareness to know what they want. So then that's a request. The request has to go to FEMA. FEMA has to look across the federal agencies and figure out where they might ask for it to come from. Once they've figured that out, they have to write a mission assignment request that has to go to that federal agency. The federal agency has to mobilize it. It has to move across the country. It has to go into the incident staging base, be processed, and then come out of the incident staging base and go to an incident commander who can employ it. That process takes time. That takes a lot of time. Meanwhile, so if you're going to design an exercise for that, the timeline of the exercise has to be at least this long. Right? In the National Guard, we're looking at, okay, we want to go from an immediate bang to
Yes.
standing up our forces and moving forward.
Also,
And so our timeline is here.
Yeah,
And so now you've got these overlying timelines, but you've got all these players that have very limited time that they can actually offer up to an exercise. So where do you put their focus? Do you focus them on the first 72 hours? Which in a CSZ environment is really just working on COOP. That's all you can do in the first 72 hours because there's not a lot else happening, really. Or do you put their focus way over here on the sustainment of these large-scale resources? Well, so now FEMA's got one idea and we've got another, and the state DOC is in the middle trying to protect all those players to make certain that their time is used adequately. And then we started to, and that was just when there was 3 of us, then when we started to incorporate other participants like U.S. Northern Command or U.S. Transportation Command that had other agenda items, it became very complicated. In the end, the structure for Cascadia Rising, there was Cascadia Rising, oh my goodness, Vigilant Guard and, what was
Art and Sentry.
Art and Sentry. Art and Sentry had a Part A and a Part B because they needed to do a time jump to get to where they could exercise sustainment. And the rest of the exercise would not allow them to do that. So they had to actually create their own exercise, attached but separate. It was a knockdown, drag-out fight to design that exercise. But in the end, a very successful exercise that everyone participated in. I think to this day I haven't heard any really negative comments about it. Everyone had an opportunity to learn an awful lot. So it was a great exercise. And oh, by the way, I'll use this right here to shamelessly plug for it. The Adjutant General has asked that we do this exact exercise again, only larger, in 2022. So if you're still in the area and you want to be a participant, grab one to anyone's shirt tails you can. And there'll be a massive earthquake exercise here in Washington, Oregon, Idaho. Alaska wants to play too. FEMA's on board. 2022.
so in line with that, I got the initial emails, totally unrelated, untrained in any of this stuff. Back, I remember that Dudley and Simon were involved in one of these initial meetings, trying to participate, but it really was way at the upper levels of what you're telling me is explaining what happened, because basically I go down as a volunteer, no time paid, nothing, which is fine. But in the end, it was nothing about boots on the ground. It was just an exercise because there's only 4 days, right? And so that's what you're explaining to me.
What we tried to do, and in some jurisdictions we were very successful, in other jurisdictions we were less
You have to be
successful,
a local
is we tried to give those local jurisdictions the ability to
get injects in there.
do what they wanted, to shape their part of the exercise. And some of those local jurisdictions did great things with that.
Right.
Some of them, they had just very involved exercises going on at the local level.
Yeah.
Other local jurisdictions didn't quite catch on in time and couldn't maneuver in time when they figured it out to build a good exercise. Even though they had great learning opportunity despite that. So when we do it again in 22, and probably every 5 years thereafter, it's an opportunity for everyone to get on board more and figure out more how they train, what they train, and what they need to train.
2022.
During the preparation, I heard you say several times for the National Guard, this is mission rehearsal rather than an exercise.
Absolutely.
And maybe you can talk about that a little bit. I know you put really not only boots on the ground, but also equipment, moved it around and tried to mimic the situation.
Absolutely. Ryan a few minutes ago briefed that we had 3 no-fail missions. Those are 3 no-fail missions for the members that live and work here in the state of Washington from the Washington National Guard. But the mission sets that the Washington National Guard has accepted, and in our planning, if you haven't seen our plan, that we are adamantly planning to do, is far more than 3. It's a massive amount of missions, basically bringing in forces from around the nation. If you take a look at the summer's events in Puerto Rico and Virgin Islands, if you take that event and look at the state of Washington, it's really very similar. We become an island after this earthquake. And so we have to reach out across the nation and bring resources in here to affect missions. It's very similar. The difference, of course, is that Puerto Rico and Virgin Islands didn't really have a plan for that. We have a plan for it, and we are adamantly planning. We are very aggressively planning to do that. So first Evergreen Tremor and then Cascadia Rising were, for us, the Washington National Guard, rehearsals of our plan. And it's sometimes, I'm sure that Dr. Scholl heard this at one of the planning meetings, the MPM or the FPM, folks would get up and talk about their exercise. And it was very important to us in the Washington National Guard that they understand, to us, it's not just an exercise. An exercise is great because you can lay out your training objective and then you can see how close you get to it. So, for us, it's far beyond that. For us, it was a rehearsal. We already knew what we needed to do to affect the lives and the safety of the population of the state of Washington. We just needed to go see if we could really do it. We needed to go see, can we actually bring the pieces together and do this? And so it was a rehearsal for us, and it was important for us to transmit that message to the participants in Cascadia Rising. And I'm thankful to hear that hopefully I got the message across.
You did.
So 2016 Cascadia Rising. For us, we call it a 50-year plan. And what that means is that we will continue to plan it. I'm retiring, but Ryan's on board. We're going to continue this planning effort. And like I said, probably every 5 years or so, we'll go back into another major exercise. And we will continue to do that. And to quote the Adjutant General, planning for this event will never be done until the earth begins to shake. Once the earth begins to shake, we will go from planning to execution. And then once we've finished execution and the earthquake is over and people are going back to normal, we'll probably go back into a planning effort to get ready for the next one, because these things are cyclical and they do recur. But everything we learned getting up to this point, through 2013, is being sustained now in our Joint Operations Center, and we're better for it. We're much better for it. In 2017, we responded to Sprang Flooding. It was a relatively minor flooding in a single town in eastern Washington, and previously, prior to 2013, it probably would have been a very significant event for us to mobilize resources to do that. By 2017, that became so easy, it was almost a non-event. But the reality is that the state declared an emergency, a disaster, and we mobilized troops. But for us, it was so easy, it's hardly worth mentioning. 2017 wildfires were a significant year, but nothing like 14 and 15 for us. So again, not that tough. We had improved so much that it's much better. Not to say it's perfect, we still have stuff to do. Also in 2017, of course, we had Hurricanes Harvey, Irma, and Maria. And we, the state of Washington, National Guard specifically, other agencies also supported, but I don't have their data. The National Guard, we sent forces to Texas, Florida, the Virgin Islands, Puerto Rico, and actually to Virginia, which was coordinating part of the national level effort. So we had folks that were in Virginia at National Guard Bureau coordinating national level effort. So we've gotten pretty good. And within the National Guard, we've been recognized now across the 50 states and 4 territories as a lead state because of our capabilities here, which is very unusual for the state of Washington. Normally, the hurricane states are the domestic disaster response states for the National Guard because they deal with it every year. For the state of Washington, this outlier way out in the Pacific Northwest someplace, it's kind of odd for us to be in that group. It's kind of fun. All right, so priorities, or preparedness priorities. And I don't mean to spend a lot of time on this. I want to go through this relatively quickly. But now, we've worked with our Washington State legislators, and we have an annual budget that allow us to prepare for some of these state-level missions. Things like, specifically, wildland firefighting. We put people through training every year to maintain firefighting capacity for the state of Washington. These liaison officers, as we talked about a few minutes ago, these are critical to our efforts. Not only do they help us gain situational awareness on what that incident commander is going through and what he needs, but they are also our direct representatives. They're our salesmen, if you will, to those incident commanders. And we have, if you look back at the numbers we were throwing up there, at OSO we had 700 people out there. Then later that year for fires, another 700. Then the next year we had 1,500. And why? Was it because the missions changed so much? Or was it because people were starting to understand what the National Guard could provide? And they started asking for us. We have incident commanders now every summer that as soon as they stand up their incident command for a fire, the first question they ask is, where is my National Guard liaison officer? I want that guy here, that guy or gal here. And for us that's great because it gets us in there and allows us to be helpful. Let's see. our joint staff, I think Ryan mentioned this just a little bit, our joint staff now goes through all their FEMA ICS training to include 300 and 400, right? So 1, 2, 7, 8, and 300 and 400, which are the resident courses. So that we have a basic understanding up through advanced ICS so that we can talk apples to apples with incident commanders. It was rather unusual for our Adjutant General to task the National Guard with developing the CSD response plan. Most states, Oregon is a great example, would go to their emergency management agency and say, hey, come up with this plan. Our TAG asked us to do it, and initially there was some pushback from some of our state partners, and even within our own agency, the state EOC didn't quite understand that. But one of the great things the military can bring to bear for domestic response is planning capability. We actually have planners. A lot of those civilian agencies out there, planners are a luxury they simply cannot afford. And so to use the National Guard, turns out, was a stroke of brilliance. Although it has not been without its challenges. We had to learn a new language. We had to go out and make friends with a lot of different agencies and a lot of different entities that we wouldn't normally understand or know how to work with. But once we got through those hurdles, it's a stroke of genius to have the military do the planning. Nowadays, the Washington National Guard units maintain a specific readiness posture for domestic response. In this case, I'm talking specifically about flooding, but we already talked fires. Those, of course, are our most common problems here, floods and fires. And then, of course, they're also doing, for the earthquake stuff now, we've got specific relationships geographically around the state with every Homeland Security region in the state of Washington. And now we go out and habitually conduct joint planning with our civilian emergency managers. And that's something that never occurred prior to 2013. They didn't know us, we didn't know them, which was quite honest. It's a travesty. But now, we have first name basis within each Homeland Security region. It's a much better relationship. All right, so to wrap this whole thing up, the Washington National Guard, what are we? Well, nowadays, we are a focused, ready, competent force with great capability that's leaning forward to support the residents of the state of Washington. And of course, if anyone here is looking at getting recruited, you can find us online. But seriously, the state of Washington has employed their National Guard pretty significantly over the last 5 years. Our learning curve has been nearly vertical. We've learned a lot. We've gotten a lot better at what we do. And we are here for the residents of the state of Washington.
That's wonderful.
So,
thank you so much. And we have time for questions. I want to begin with one, and that is we heard from, we read in after action reports, but also heard from presenters here before that for something like Cascadia Rising, we need to shift the paradigm from pull to push. Now, what does that mean for the National Guard?
well, and I want to be careful how I say this. First off, I didn't say this at the very beginning, and I should have. Ryan and I are really honored to be part of this speaking series. You gave us the list of names of those who've come before us, and I think I know all of them. I've worked with all of them, and that's a pretty impressive group of folks. To be included in that number is pretty awe-inspiring. So thanks for having us do this. Now, to again be really egotistical, the pull-push paradigm shift was brought about by the National Guard, in my opinion, was brought about by the National Guard's planning team. When we began to realize, and sometimes it takes someone looking from the outside, someone, you know, it took a kid on the side of the street to realize the emperor wasn't wearing any clothes, right? Sometimes you need that. And so when our planning team was looking at how the National Incident Management System worked, we realized that that's not going to work in a Cascadia subduction zone environment. That's the amount of time it takes to identify a need and request a resource, as I mentioned here earlier, as I mentioned that process. That's all a delay. That's a delay of game when lives are on the line. And so we had to do better than that. We had to figure out a way to get those resources coming. Thankfully, in the FEMA plan that was published in December of 2013, they published the high-track study that had been published in 2011. The high-track study is the best assumption we have for what's really going to happen after a CSZ. And so our planning team used the high-track study and analyzed it in great detail to determine what we thought the true gaps were going to be. What's the problem really going to look like after 5 minutes of shaking? And then we identified what we needed to have here. And so the difference between pull and push is we said we can request all that stuff now. We can request it now. We can make a plan to have it start moving as soon as there's 5 minutes of shaking. They don't have to wait for an additional request. And so that was kind of the start of it, was we had to have a plan to have this stuff moving. We had to have a plan to get the right stuff here as fast as possible. If we wait until people in the state of Washington can stand up, get communications, and ask for it, it could be days or weeks, and people could be dying. So that just doesn't work. So that was in a nutshell where we decided we had to go from a pull scenario, which is the normal National Incident Management System, to a push scenario where you pre-plan it, you identify it for movement, you get it all lined up and ready to move, you know where it's going to go, what it's going to do within a 90% probability, and you have it ready to move on 5 minutes of shaking. And we are still to this day planning very, very hard for that. In fact, I think we mentioned on the way up here, I've got one more presentation to give before I actually retire. And that presentation is to a coalition of the Joint Domestic Operations Officers for all the National Guard states. And we are taking our list of identified gaps, we've broken it out by all the states that we want to provide and what they want to provide. And the briefing I'm giving them is trying to convince them to start signing the dotted line to build EMACs for everything on that list. Some 400 lines of need, if you will, 400 different unit types that we're bringing in. So.
Thank you so much. I don't want to monopolize the questioning, but I have one more, and that is regarding the 2022 exercise. The high track you mentioned was conducted in 2011. And pretty comprehensive. Is there any plan to fund an additional high-track type simulation? And the exercise in 2020, will it also incorporate aftershocks? And you know, I mean, we know that much of the damage most probably occurs during the aftershocks, which were not incorporated in Cascadia Rising in 2016.
So there were some aftershocks as injects in Cascadia Rising. And to correct you, just so that everybody knows, 2022 is the big exercise, 2022. The actual exercise design has not yet begun to occur. I would like to hope that the scenario is as realistic as possible. But again, I know that all those entities are going to come together and fight over where their piece of the timeline is. So the scenario should be fairly solid, but the timeline's going to have to be flexible. I've already provided a recommendation for that to Lt. Dudley and State EOC, and we'll see where that goes.
Okay.
But those teams have to come together, and just like in 16, they have to build that. So there'll be compromise. We'll have to see where it goes. Going back to your first question on the high-track study, I don't know that anyone wants to spend millions of dollars to redo that study. And the bottom line is, it's a series of assumptions anyways.
Yeah.
They did redo some analysis on the tsunami modeling. And so that's available, because that was a definite shortage in the high-track study. It didn't have very good tsunami modeling. But there's new data out for tsunami modeling inside the Puget Sound area, which is huge. But in the end, that high-track study, all it really provides is a list of assumptions. And until the earthquake happens, and you see how it rips, and the length and duration and the speed, all of that affects it. So until that happens, the high-track study is really, and it's really pretty good. I mean, you can go in there and make some new assumptions and change some assumptions, and it'll spit out different results. But the reality is, for a planner's perspective, that's good enough. I don't think it needs to be redone. We could spend that time and effort looking at the plan, the response, and improve that.
Thank you.
That's my 2 cents.
Other questions?
Is high track the same as the crew report that was used for
No, the crew, the Cascade Region Earthquake Work Group, was a coalition of scientists that came together back in 2005. Well, actually in 2005 they published their first white paper. And that white paper was used by FEMA to commission the HITRAC. HITRAC was actually an agency under the Department of Homeland Security. It was the Homeland Infrastructure Threat and Risk Analysis Center. And so in 2005, the crew published their white paper. 2007, FEMA commissioned HITRAC to do the study. It took them from 2007 to 2011 to complete the study. They published it in 2011. That data was wrapped up in the FEMA plan that was then published in December 2013. And HITRAC has since changed its name. It's now the Office of Infrastructure Assessment or something like that.
My question, so what I'm learning about what you said about OSO was that there was an extreme lack of communication, even just even identifying the full scale. So my question is something on the size of the CSZ. How are we going to know what it's like even on the peninsula? I mean, how are we going to get the information to know how to respond?
Well, so all of these things are building on each other. The SR 530 landslide, it's absolutely true that on the first day, there were a handful of people that had total situational awareness. There was about 5 of them, and every one of them was a pilot, right? Particularly Bill Quistorf and the guys from Snohomish County. They absolutely knew what they were dealing with.
Okay.
And they had filmed it with their cameras on their helicopters. But they did not give, and we can almost chuckle in hindsight now, they didn't give that imagery to the incident commanders. So the incident commanders had no idea what they were dealing with until about day 3, where they realized that this whole thing was one big mess and that's what they had. And the AARs identified that from the SR 530. And now we know that, oh my goodness, that it was such a simple fix and it took us so long and it cost so much time. Fortunately, we don't think it cost any lives, but it cost time. And so now we have gotten through that, and we've continued in each of these other disasters that we've participated in. We've continued to work the situational awareness piece.
Okay.
And now we have, in Ryan's part of this, he talked about IAA, Information Assurance and Assessment, or Information Assessment, and help me out. IAA. It's not a term we're familiar with because in the military we call it ISR, but in the domestic world you can't use the word surveillance and military in the same conversation. So we call it IAA, Information Assessment and something. So, but bottom line is that's all about situational awareness. That's us applying every capability we have. If it's a FLIR mounted on RC-26,
Right.
or a P3 ASW platform, or a drone, or even a soldier on the ground with a radio, every resource we have to make certain that we gain and transmit situational awareness. In Cascadia Rising, we used a new website out there. I didn't talk at all in this about any of the technology, but we established a website that was available to everyone in the state of Washington to go to, where we would compile all this data.
No.
So all these videos, it was all arranged geographically and chronologically. So if someone wanted to go look at a bridge in Mason County, as soon as we had imagery, it was up, and anyone could go look at it. All you had to have, the key was to have internet connectivity, which meant that we had to provide these GISCs all over the place. But as soon as an incident commander had internet connectivity, they could go up and they could get all this IA that we could provide. So that's one of the things we're working on.
Other questions?
Thanks so much for your time.
Well, I just want to say you're certainly a very prominent speaker here, or two speaker, and on part of everybody. I want to thank you for your service and for this presentation.
Well, thank you. It's certainly our pleasure.
Thank you.